We will now hear from Mike McCabe, Director of the Midwestern Office of the Council of State Governments, or what we know as CSG. Mike oversees a team that provides research and staff support services to several groups of state officials, including primarily the Midwestern Legislative Conference. MEC has had a long-standing relationship with the Midwestern Legislative Conference, as our compact is an outgrowth from the MLC. We welcome Mike every year to give us a post-election update, and this year we have just a few things to talk about. Mike, we all look forward to hearing your remarks. May I turn it over to Mike McCabe?
Great, thank you, Representative Ballard.
You're welcome.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Let me just open my presentation real quick. All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Representative Ballard. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to members of the MEC staff. It's always a pleasure for me to be here with you during these meetings. I have to confess, I wish it was in person, but I know you all feel the same way. I look forward to the next time we can be together in person. Also want to say, extend greetings on behalf of CSG to everybody, including on behalf of the officers and members of the Midwestern Legislative Conference, and also on behalf of CSG's National Chair, a person you all know well in the MEC community, Wisconsin Representative, now Senator-elect Joan Ballweg, who I believe is on this meeting. So shout out to Joan. And want to be sure also to say thank you, Tom. It's always a pleasure to follow you. Anytime you get a chance to follow the Mechanator, you should take it. And I'm going to let that be my guidepost going forward. It's also helpful to hear your perspective on on what's going on at the federal level. I'm here today as usual, to present an update on recent developments in the Midwestern states in hopes that helps to inform your thinking about issues that you all are dealing with in your respective states and roles. I'll take a look at some of the highlights of this year's legislative sessions, as well as a recap of last week's election results. And along the way, may try to point to a few things that are coming down the pipeline. In lieu of more disciplined editing on my part, I'm just going to go really fast. So let's jump in. How do you begin to, let's see, are you able to see the screen? Let me just, I don't seem to be able to advance my slide. Just a minute. There we go. So how do you begin to describe what many consider to be a year unlike any other, a year that will be remembered for so many things, including a global pandemic, an economic crisis, a renewed sense of urgency surrounding issues of social justice, and so much more. Not to mention the election season that has consumed our attention for so long now. Where do you even start? So much has happened in recent months, and so profoundly has our sense of normal been altered since last winter's end that now in early November, it can be hard sometimes to remember what the world looked like and felt like as recently as early March. At the state level, both nationally and here in the Midwest, there was certainly an era of anticipation going into 2020. After all, it was an election year and much was at stake. At the same time, our states were mostly doing very well, both economically and fiscally. And after a decade of slow recovery from the last downturn, it finally felt as though the Great Recession was behind us. Most economic indicators were still pointing up, and the outlook for the near future was very bright. And then COVID-19 arrived, and suddenly everything changed. Though first and foremost, a public health crisis that will and should be remembered primarily for its devastating impact on the health and well-being of so many people around the world, the coronavirus pandemic has also turned our economy upside down while reshaping the way we think about so many facets of our daily lives. It has also impacted the operations of our public institutions, including our state legislatures, and I'll certainly be talking more about that as we go. But first, without losing sight of the inherent nature of the COVID pandemic as a public health crisis, let me turn for a moment to its economic and fiscal impact with an emphasis on the Midwestern states. First, the economy. After steady, if unspectacular growth for more than a decade, including 23 consecutive quarters of GDP growth going into 2020, the US economy suffered a sharp downturn almost immediately after the pandemic arrived. By the end of March, the impact of shutdown orders across the country began to be reflected in the data, and the US posted an annualized 5% decline in GDP for the first quarter of the year. That harbinger of things to come was followed by a second quarter contraction at an annualized rate of 31.4%, the largest quarterly GDP drop since the Great Depression. At the same time, the US unemployment rate spiked from 3.5% in February to 14.7% in April. And by the time fiscal year 2020 drew to a close at the state level, in June, a seismic shift in the economic and fiscal conditions was well underway. All 50 states and the District of Columbia posted GDP declines in the second quarter ranging from a low of 20.4% in the District of Columbia to a high of more than 42% in Hawaii and Nevada. Here in the Midwest, declines ranged from 27.6% in North Dakota to a regional high of 37.6% in Michigan, with 8 of the 12 MEC states posting drops in excess of 30%. More recently, the economic news has been much better. Fueled by a summer slowing of COVID cases and the gradual reopening of the nation's economy, US GDP grew by a record rate of 33.1% during the third quarter of this year. And just last Friday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the national unemployment rate had declined in October to 6.9%, almost a point better than expected and well under the double-digit highs of summer. Through September, state-by-state unemployment rates ranged from a regional and national low of 3.5% in Nebraska to a regional high 47th nationally of 10.2% in Illinois. 9 of the 12 MEC states posted unemployment rates that ranked among the nation's 20 lowest. So comparatively speaking, this region was faring a little bit better on the employment scale. Third quarter GDP figures for individual states have not yet been published, but it's reasonable to expect that they will mirror the national trends. What they won't capture, however, is the even more recent upsurge in COVID cases across the country, a disturbing trend that will likely hinder any economic recovery as the pandemic-related public health crisis continues. It's been a similar story on the fiscal front, where the arrival of the pandemic dramatically altered previous trajectories, leaving the states to face an uncertain but daunting future with respect to revenues and budgets. At the outset of 2020, in other words, midway through the fiscal year that ended on June 30th in most of our states, it looked as though the states were on course to maintain the strong financial condition that most have enjoyed in recent years. Revenues were generally running ahead of projections, fund balances were at or near record highs, and budgets were flush, with aggregate state spending expected to grow for a 10th consecutive year, albeit at a slightly lower rate than in fiscal year 19. But then the pandemic hit, and again, suddenly all bets were off. As economic growth came to a sudden halt, so too did state revenue collections, and during the final quarter of FY 2020, budget officials and lawmakers scrambled to revise their projections, to close unexpected budget gaps, and to overhaul their spending plans for FY 21. With revenues drying up just as spending demands to cope with the public health crisis soared, the budget outlook for states suddenly shifted from strong to dismal. And some of the earliest attempts to measure the pandemic's likely fiscal impact were just plain scary. In May, for example, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimated that by the end of FY 22, states would face pandemic-related budget shortfalls for the 3-year period totaling $650 billion. That figure included an aggregate budget deficit of some $460 billion by the end of FY 21, which is less than 8 months from today. In the months that followed, similarly daunting fiscal impact estimates were published by Moody's and by the Tax Foundation, among others. More recently, as the economic news improved a bit, however, so too did the state fiscal forecast, at least in the short run. Last month, for instance, the Pew Charitable Trust estimated that aggregate state budget shortfalls for the 2-year period ending in FY 21 were likely to be somewhere closer to $125 to $200 billion. And what does it say that that is supposed to be good news? Where that figure finally lands will depend, of course, on decisions yet to be made by governors and legislators as they adjust previously approved budgets for the current fiscal year. The availability of additional federal stimulus money could also change the outlook for state budgets. But ultimately, the largest potential variable in the equation will be the continuing impact of the pandemic on our state and national economies. All of these factors are difficult to quantify as we look ahead, but we are beginning to get a better sense of how the fiscal environment has actually changed since the pandemic began. According to the National Association of State Budget Officers, aggregate state revenues declined by 3% in fiscal year 2020. When compared to originally projected and budgeted revenue growth of 3% over FY19, that means that states found themselves facing a 6% negative swing in revenues for the year, most of which didn't even begin to show up until the fourth quarter. Virtually every revenue source upon which states rely was affected by this trend, with disproportionately steep declines in personal and corporate income tax collections, among others. As the economy began to reopen during the summer, revenue trends improved in some states, and in a few here in the Midwest, collections even exceeded projections during the first quarter of FY21. In the aggregate, however, the forecast for current year revenues remains daunting. Given the recent resurgence of the coronavirus almost everywhere, there's reason to be concerned about the potential impact of the continuing pandemic on state budgets. And it's worth noting that even without a pandemic to cope with, it took states more than a decade to fully recover from the last economic downturn. For all these reasons, states will likely continue to face some significant fiscal challenges in the coming years. Next, let's turn to the legislative sessions this year, which, as I noted earlier, were significantly impacted by the arrival of the pandemic. As the virus began to take its toll on both public health and economic activity, there was an immediate shuffling of legislative priorities in many states. Before sessions were eventually suspended in most capitals, lawmakers turned their attention to a wide array of pandemic response measures, while other issues were necessarily backburnered or deferred to next year. With unfinished business remaining to be completed, legislatures were forced to tackle a number of operational issues as they searched for new and safer ways to resume the lawmaking process in the midst of a public health crisis. And of course, 2020 was an election year, which meant that politics were never far from the surface as legislative sessions continued. Let's take a closer look at some of the key issues and concerns that eventually had the greatest impact on this year's sessions. Without question, the issue that eventually emerged as the top legislative priority across the region this year was the coronavirus pandemic and various strategies to minimize its impact on public health and the economy. Following the outset of the pandemic, states enacted a variety of measures intended to protect and assist first responders and frontline healthcare workers, to shore up small businesses and to ensure the safe delivery of essential services to communities hardest hit by the virus. Virtually every legislature that hadn't already completed its work, which means most of them, eventually addressed the impact of the pandemic in some form or fashion. A complete rundown of all the pandemic-related legislation considered this year would easily consume the rest of my time this afternoon, but a sampling of the measures enacted in several states illustrates the breadth of concerns addressed by lawmakers across the Midwest. In Minnesota, for example, after initially appropriating $20.9 million to an existing contingency account for public health emergencies, lawmakers later approved a $330 million measure that included $200 million for a new COVID-19 Minnesota fund to cover a wide array of pandemic-related costs. The fund provided support for child care centers, homeless services, food banks, small businesses, and tribes, among others. The state also beefed up its investments in public health infrastructure, including hospitals, medical equipment, testing facilities, nursing homes, quarantine areas, and more. Other measures approved in Minnesota included a bill modifying school employment practices and providing waivers of certain assessment, graduation, and teacher licensing requirements, as well as a measure allowing restaurants to sell liquor with takeout food orders without first obtaining a license. A similar measure, easing liquor license requirements for bars and restaurants affected by the pandemic, was approved by lawmakers in Illinois. They also enacted bills to stiffen criminal penalties for assaults against retail employees committed during periods of public health emergency and providing workers' compensation benefits to essential frontline workers who contract COVID during the pandemic. Iowa lawmakers approved a measure providing COVID-related liability protections to hospitals, nursing homes, and other businesses, and similar proposals were considered or approved in several other states as well. Among the hundreds of other COVID-related bills considered or enacted this year were a Missouri measure requiring insurers to cover the costs of COVID-19 testing, a Nebraska bill providing funding for the establishment of a new University of Nebraska Health Center focused on the nation's response to pandemics, a South Dakota bill creating a new small business loan fund and waiving regulations that might prevent businesses from complying with pandemic-related public safety orders, and a Wisconsin measure waiving professional licensing provisions and school testing requirements during the pandemic. There was much more, of course, but this should at least give you a sense of the range of issues that were being driven largely by the pandemic. Next, social justice. The tragic killing of George Floyd during an arrest by Minneapolis police officers in late May not only ignited a wave of protests and demonstrations across the country, but also served as a catalyst for new legislative efforts to address an array of social justice issues related to policing, criminal justice reform, racial disparities in education, healthcare, and economic opportunity, and more. Without question, some of those efforts have been hampered early on by the pandemic-related suspension and contraction of this year's legislative sessions, which were already well underway by the time of the Floyd tragedy. Nevertheless, social justice issues have already been addressed in several states this year, and they will undoubtedly be taken up in others during fall veto sessions in the weeks ahead and during the 2021 regular sessions beginning in January. In July, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signed a bill to prevent police misconduct just one day after the measure was debated and unanimously passed by both houses of the legislature, all on the same day it was introduced. The bill bans most chokeholds, allows the Attorney General to investigate officer-involved deaths, requires annual training for law enforcement officers on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques, and prohibits officers who have been fired for misconduct from being rehired in Iowa. A similar measure was approved by lawmakers in Minnesota during a special session of the legislature in July. The Minnesota bill banned the use of chokeholds in most cases, prohibited warrior-style training of police officers, established an independent unit within the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to investigate officer-involved deaths, and added 2 citizens to the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Board. Elsewhere around the region, the Michigan legislature approved $4.2 million in funding for crisis response training for law enforcement officers. And Governor Eric Holcomb announced in August that Indiana state troopers would soon be required to wear body cameras and undergo use of force training. He also unveiled plans to establish a new cabinet-level Chief Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Officer in Indiana. More recently, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus has prepared an omnibus proposal seeking to address racial inequality in health, education, economic access, and criminal justice that will be taken up by lawmakers during the fall veto session beginning next week in Springfield. And the Black Legislative Caucus in Indiana has announced plans to introduce a series of criminal justice reforms in January. The measures will include proposed bans on no-knock warrants and chokeholds, as well as the removal of police officers from public schools. Another issue that surfaced in several Midwestern states this year was the legislative oversight of emergency executive powers. Though triggered by the flurry of emergency declarations and gubernatorial executive orders that followed the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic, the question of just how far a governor may go unilaterally in addressing public emergencies is one that is potentially relevant in any crisis. So it wasn't really surprising when lawmakers in some states began pushing back a bit in response to what some perceived as executive overreach with respect to the nature and duration of gubernatorial actions taken without legislative input or approval. And in some cases, what started as a 2-branch battle between the executive and the legislature eventually drew in the third as the parties turned to the courts for resolution. In Michigan Michigan, for example, an interbranch fight over the ability of the governor to extend the state's emergency declaration beyond the end of its original 28-day period wasn't resolved until the state Supreme Court ruled that the governor had exceeded her authority by extending the declaration without legislative approval. In Kansas, lawmakers and the governor have thus far resolved their issues related to subsequent extensions of the state's original emergency declaration without judicial intervention. But the multi-branch composition of that state's finance council, which approves the extensions, helps to ensure that legislative leaders have a role in overseeing emergency executive actions. And in Minnesota, lawmakers have been called into special session no fewer than 5 times since the 2020 regular season ended in May. That's because state law arguably requires the governor to give the legislature a chance to rescind his emergency powers each time he extends the original emergency declaration for an additional 30-day period. So far, each time the legislature has been called back into session, the Republican-controlled Senate has voted to rescind the Democratic governor's authority, but the Democratic-controlled House has declined to do so, and so the declaration has been extended. Incidentally, a 6th special session was called by the governor just yesterday and will be convened in St. Paul beginning on Thursday. Similar issues have also emerged in connection with the expenditure of pandemic-related federal assistance to the states. This too is likely to be an area in which legislatures will seek to protect and exercise their oversight authority over executive actions going forward. Another issue impacted by the coronavirus pandemic this year was the administration of elections. In an effort to make voting easier for citizens concerned about potential exposure to the virus in crowded polling places, many states acted swiftly to encourage early voting, mail-in balloting, and the advanced counting of ballots received before Election Day, among other reforms. Illinois, for example, expanded vote by mail for last week's general election and sent unsolicited applications for mail-in ballots to anyone who had voted in state elections since 2018. Election Day was also recognized as a state holiday for public schools and state election workers. Minnesota authorized local governments to adopt special procedures to facilitate voting during both the primary and general elections, and it required local authorities to begin processing absentee ballots starting 14 days before Election Day. And Missouri temporarily loosened its usual restrictions on mail balloting to make it easier for voters to cast their ballots during the pandemic. Across the Midwest, there were numerous other examples as well. As we all saw last week, millions of Americans readily embraced the transition to early and mail-in balloting this year, and efforts to make permanent many of the procedural changes that were introduced or expanded on an experimental basis this year are likely to follow in the years to come. In hindsight, one of the ways in which this year's legislative session stood out from those of other years was that so many came to an abrupt and extended halt in mid-March. Least affected were states like Indiana, where short election year sessions were already nearing their scheduled end just as the virus arrived. But for most others, including nearly all of the MEC states, the onset of the pandemic meant an unscheduled break in the legislative action, followed by a lot of uncertainty about when, where, and how to reconvene. Eventually, all of the Midwestern legislatures that suspended sessions before completing their business found ways to reconvene, if only briefly, to finish their work on budgets and other time-sensitive priorities before finally adjourning sine die. When they did reconvene, some like South Dakota and Wisconsin conducted virtual sessions for the first time or experimented with new and safer ways of transacting business in person, as in Illinois, where the Senate temporarily occupied the more spacious House chamber, while the House of Representatives convened in a nearby concert venue to ensure adequate social distancing between members. Others, like the Nebraska unicameral, strategically deployed plexiglass partitions or introduced new health screening procedures to ensure the safety of members, staff, and the general public alike. In the end, most of the region's regular legislative sessions were considerably shorter than usual this year, but many were later augmented by special sessions, including at least 11 in 5 states here in the Midwest, quite a bit more than usual. One result of this year's contracted legislative sessions was the deferral of anticipated session issues in several states. Still unresolved, for example, is the question of Medicaid expansion in Kansas, and a long-awaited overhaul of the school funding formula in Ohio has yet to be completed, although it will likely be taken up during the fall lame duck session that begins in Columbus this week. Other such issues include the proposed establishment of a prescription drug monitoring system in Missouri and potential changes to the state's ethics laws in Illinois. Despite the unusual circumstances that characterized this year's sessions, the region's legislature still considered or passed bills addressing a wide range of other issues this year. And you'll see a sample on this slide and the next. I'm not going to go through all of these in the interest of time, but there were some significant pieces of legislation unrelated to the topics I've already touched on that made their way to the finish line, like the property tax relief bill in Nebraska, significant water quality improvement measures in Michigan and Indiana, a 10-year, $10 billion transportation funding plan in Kansas, broadband access proposals in several states, and more. Before we leave 2020 behind, let's take a quick look at last week's election results. Here's what was at stake on Election Day 1 week ago today. There were gubernatorial races on the ballot in 11 states across the country, including just 3 in the Midwest, Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota. Also, there were legislative races in 44 states, including every legislative chamber in the Midwest except the Michigan Senate. And there were more than 120 ballot measures in 35 states and territories, including 18 in 8 Midwestern states. Also, as you may have heard, there was a presidential race to be decided, but I'm sure we've all had our fill of that one, so you'll be glad to know I'm not going to dwell on it. As a reminder, this is what the partisan landscape across the Midwest looked like heading into the elections. Republicans enjoyed unified control of state government in 6 of the region's 12 states, 7 if you count Nebraska. Democrats controlled state government in just 1, Illinois, and partisan control was divided in the other 4, with Democratic governors and Republican legislatures in Kansas, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and a Democratic governor with a split legislature in Minnesota. And despite the fact that Democrats had posted net seat gains in 2/3 of the Midwestern states in 2018, Republicans still occupied more than 60% of the region's 1,747 legislative seats. That meant they held majorities in 19 of the region's 22 partisan legislative chambers going into this year's elections. Coming out of the elections, this is what the partisan landscape across the Midwest will look like in 2021. Notice anything interesting there? 2019, 2021. That's right, nothing changed in the Midwest. As you may have heard, last Tuesday night was a pretty good night for Republicans when you look at the down ballot races nationally. Despite the conventional wisdom of pollsters going into November 3, there was no blue wave at the federal level, and at the state level, almost nothing changed. Incumbents or incumbent parties prevailed in 10 of the 11 gubernatorial races, with a Republican succeeding a Democrat in the open race in Montana for the only partisan control change among governors nationwide. And nationally, partisan control of state legislative chambers changed in just 3 places: the New Hampshire House, the New Hampshire Senate, and the Alaska House, all of which were won by Republicans. And that's the fewest number of partisan control changes at the state legislative level since 1928. Here in the Midwest, there were no partisan control swings at all. Based on preliminary numbers, and please bear in mind that final results are still pending in numerous races, it appears that Republicans gained seats in as many as 10 or 11 Midwestern legislative chambers, while Democrats likely gained seats in only a couple. In the aggregate, however, net seat gains were modest at best compared to previous election cycles. It's also worth remembering, however, that the real significance of this year's legislative races was that in most states, the winners will get to draw the lines when the next redistricting process begins, and that's coming soon. Despite pre-election polling suggesting that partisan control of 2 or 3 Midwestern chambers was potentially in play, none of those chambers flipped. So going into 2021, Republicans will continue to control 19 of the region's 22 partisan legislative chambers and more than 60% of the seats. And Minnesota remains the nation's only divided state legislature. Here's a look at the trend lines illustrating the way partisan composition of the Midwestern legislatures has changed over the years. This graphic has not yet been updated to reflect the results of the 2020 elections, since so many of them are still pending. But when all is said and done, the gap shown here will likely widen just a bit. And these next two maps illustrate the partisan seat gains posted by the parties in each of the last two legislative election cycles. As you can see, Republicans fared well in 2016, Democrats fared well in 2018. But I expect that when this map is updated, it will most likely be red again next time around. As noted, all three of the Republican governors seeking re-election in the Midwest, Eric Holcomb in Indiana, Mike Parson in Missouri, and Doug Burgum in North Dakota, easily held their seats. So the table you see here is essentially unchanged from last year. As I also mentioned, there were a number of constitutional amendments and voter referendums appearing on Midwestern ballots this year. I won't go through all of them, but among the more interesting results, Illinois voters rejected a proposed plan to replace the state's flat income tax with a graduated tax system. Nebraska voters approved proposals to cap the interest rates that can be charged by payday lenders and to permit casino gambling at the state's racetracks. A proposed expansion of the State Board of Higher Education was rejected in North Dakota. So too was a measure that would have required approved voter-initiated constitutional amendments to be ratified by the legislature or resubmitted to voters a second time before becoming effective. Iowa voters said no to a proposed constitutional convention, and a measure requiring search warrants for access to electronic data was approved in Michigan. Finally, I can't close this recap of the 2020 election season without noting that the Midwest will soon bid a fond farewell to two of the region's longest tenured public servants. Minnesota Representative Lynn Carlson, who's on this call and has been a MEC stalwart for years, and who is retiring as the Dean of the Minnesota Legislature after 48 years in the House of Representatives. So give it up for Lynn. And also Wisconsin Senator Fred Risser, who is currently completing his 64th year of legislative service and will retire as the longest serving state legislator in United States history. Looking ahead, there's a wide range of issues on the agenda for the 2021 legislative sessions. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can scroll through them at your leisure, but a busy year to come. I thank you for the chance to visit with you this afternoon. Wish you all the best going forward and hope to see you in person next time around. Thanks very much.